You've got a mentor. It's time for Mentor Talks. Hello, everyone, and welcome to Mentor Talks. My name is Asha Bay, and I'm joining you from the Office of Alumni Affairs in ECA at the U.S. Department of State. Our office opens the door to the global Exchange Alumni Network, professional development, and grant opportunities. Where are you joining us from? Abu Dhabi or elsewhere? Let us know in the comments. Mentor Talks is a virtual series that features exchange program alumni sharing their stories, mentorship, and advice. This is your opportunity to connect with these leaders and mentors. Like today's guest, Dr. Monica Marks, an exchange alumni of 3 U.S. government exchange programs, the Fulbright, the Critical Languages Scholarship, and the Boren Fellowship, and a Rhodes Scholar. Before we get into conversation with Monica, we'd love to hear from you, our online viewers. What would you like to ask her about? Applying for scholarships like the Fulbright, studying abroad, making your career overseas? Post your questions in the comments. Now, let's turn to our guest. Welcome, Monica, and thank you for joining us.
Hello, Asha. Happy to be here.
Great. How's the weather over there?
Hot as always. Not a day of rain in this country unless they do cloud seeding.
Okay.
Make it rain.
Okay. So, Monica, we wanted to ask you, you've successfully applied for 3 U.S. government-sponsored scholarships, and you were a Rhodes Scholar at Oxford. What drove you to apply for all these scholarships, and how have they shaped your career?
As a first-generation college student, in a family where my parents didn't finish high school, actually, education was my only ladder out. And I always felt myself most strongly through education when I was reading or in school, for example. So I knew that I needed scholarships from an early age. I don't want to say it was desperation or need. There was also some ambition involved, but there was a healthy measure of that too. I also had a strong desire to travel, but no money to travel with. So scholarships became my only ladder out, really.
So, what sparked your interest in travel?
I think reading. I always loved to read as a young kid. And even though I grew up in a really rural area of the United States, in the Appalachian Mountains in eastern Kentucky, I traveled a lot intellectually through books and through films. My parents also, especially my father, really tried to cultivate in me a love of travel. Even though we had limited means financially, he would pack me up along with him when he was a janitor, when he was cleaning a floor or windows, or trying to make a sale that was far away. And we'd stay maybe in a cheap hotel in a Super 8 or something, but he would try to inculcate in me travel values like adaptability. Being able to roll with the punches. Maybe we won't find a hotel that's affordable immediately, or maybe the food won't be great at this destination, but you're seeing something new. And he tried to take me to museums too, which was a real gift. And I think those two things combined nurtured in me from a young age a real zest for seeing as much of the world as I could.
That's great. And so your first scholarship was the Critical Languages Scholarship, correct?
It was the Boren Scholarship to Tanzania.
The Boren, okay.
That was my first U.S. government scholarship. I went to the University of Louisville in Kentucky on a scholarship. Otherwise, I wouldn't have been able to go to university.
Okay. And what was that like being in Tanzania?
It was challenging and fascinating in I'd say equal measure. Tanzania, of all the places I lived or traveled, was not the place that I clicked with most, to be honest. I showered from a cup and a bucket while I was there, almost always, because the water usually wasn't running. And I discovered that I actually really, really like hot showers. it wasn't the place that my heart bonded with the most. I didn't have the most immediate connection with it like I did when I went to Turkey for the first time or to Syria for the first time. But I learned a ton. Most of my learning was not in the classroom. I was studying Swahili and refugee rights law at the University of Dar es Salaam, but we often wouldn't have class. Or the quality of instruction might not have been what I was used to academically in the United States, but there was so much situational learning. And that's what I always tell students or young people who are interested in studying abroad. Keep that in mind. Study abroad in places where, people might ask you, well, why are you studying there? Or where the electricity doesn't work a lot of the time, or where you don't have running water, because you'll learn a lot about yourself. You'll learn a lot about your privileges, and you'll learn a lot about how different themes that you're interested in intellectually are taught and understood. Everything felt easy after I'd lived in Tanzania for a year, and it was very empowering. Traveling alone in Syria or in Iraq didn't feel difficult after that. So it was a great gift, a great gift.
Yes. Yeah, and you have traveled to Syria.
That's right. Yes, before the war started in 2008.
Yeah. What was that like? I think we have some photos.
It was absolutely fantastic. I have to say, I love traveling in Arabic-speaking countries in general. The people are almost always extremely hospitable. The food is almost always delicious. But Syria holds a very special place in my heart. Syria, before the war started, there in 2011, 2012, I can't think of a place, maybe other than Istanbul, that I've enjoyed traveling in more. It's an amazing country, and I encourage everybody to see it if they can. And the Syrian people are just incredibly resilient and hospitable.
Oh, that's nice. And so actually before you went to Syria, that's when you did your Fulbright, right?
It was right after Syria. I went to Syria in 2008 a number of times over the summer. I was studying Arabic in Jordan that summer, but I had this Syria passion. I was just addicted to Syria, so I keep on taking shared taxis up to Damascus. But then the next year, I applied for a Fulbright, and I got it. And I ended up in 2009 and 2010 living in Istanbul on a Fulbright. And a lot of my mentors in university told me not to apply for it because I had never studied Turkish formally. Most of my Turkish was self-taught. I traveled a lot in the country. I'd absolutely fallen in love with it. And most of them said, Monica, if you apply for a research Fulbright, this is an incredibly competitive award. Maybe try something simpler, a little bit easier to get, maybe like the Fulbright Teaching Award or something else, or try for an Arabic-speaking country instead because you have this formal background. You did the CLS in Tunisia in Arabic. But I went for where my passion was, and I got lucky. It worked out.
Yes. It sounds like, yeah, you followed your passion, and that's like led you to basically find your niche.
Yeah. I would say, I think leaning into your loves and leaning into your strengths is one of the best pieces of advice I could give. I think oftentimes we pressure ourselves to be good at everything, to be super well-rounded, or to do what our parents or families expect us to do, or to do what we think is financially viable. That's especially true for people like me who are first-generation students who don't have any kind of financial safety net underneath them. But I found when you double down on your strengths and you really concentrate on those and you double down on your loves, things tend to align, things tend to work out because you're going with your natural grain. You're leaning into who you really are. Yes.
Yeah, I agree with that. So we have limited time, so why don't we get to some questions from our viewers because they're starting to come in. We have one from Jade who asks, how did you leverage past scholarships in your applications for future scholarships or fellowships?
I didn't just list a laundry list of scholarships that I had. I talked instead about my experiences and what I'd learned along the way. I think it was actually just as, if not more interesting to the Rhodes Committee, probably, when I ended up applying to a Rhodes after all of these other scholarships that I gotten. I think it was just as, if not more interesting to them, stories like, taking buses across Turkey and back, and traveling around Syria alone, and funny stories about learning languages along the way. And what I hope to achieve with that, I think that was just as, if not more interesting or impressive to them than just a list of the scholarships, because it brought me to life as a three-dimensional person. Never forget that the human mind thinks in stories, it thinks in images. So the sooner that you can introduce yourself to a reader of a graduate school application or a scholarship application or whatever, as somebody who's not only analytically sharp and intellectually motivated to fight some sliver of, as we say in the Rhodes community, the world's fight, but who's also a likable, maybe kind of funny, interesting, authentic, three-dimensional human being, that's great. That's great. And they'll be able to read your CV for themselves and to see the list of internships and scholarships and achievements, but especially in your essays or your interviews. Tell stories, use images, and be authentic. Let them know who you are.
Yes, be authentic. We've heard that from a few of our guests in different situations, but I think that is advice that applies across the board. I want to go back to something you said about being funny. You mentioned that you were on, we were talking before, you mentioned that you were on the Rhodes committee for NYU Abu Dhabi. And you were talking about a comic who is applying or did apply and got.
Yeah, he was one of our 2 recipients of the UAE Rhodes Scholarship this year, an Albanian student whose passions are engineering research and stand-up comedy. And he's performed in Boston and New York. And sorry, Asha, to cut you off there. Go ahead.
No, we wanted to hear more about him. I mean, like,
yeah.
What was it about his application that stood out? I mean, aside from the comic.
Well, actually, I think that was the main piece. I think that was the main piece that stood out. Because he had these 2 kind of, on the surface, incongruous passions. He loves buckling down and doing academic research on robotics on the one hand, and engineering, which seems to a lot of people as something dry, stiff, technical, etc. You don't exactly think of that person as somebody who's done live stand-up shows in Boston and New York City. But he brought the 2 of them together in a very reflective and introspective way. In his essay and in his interview, he was able to go into some very insightful detail in terms of how academic research on engineering and stand-up comedy fed into one another, what they had in common and not. And that was really interesting because it made us, I'd say, or it made me personally make some new connections. And I also liked that he didn't hide his, as people in my home community said growing up, you don't hide your light under a bushel, don't hide what makes you shine. He didn't hide his stand-up comedy. I think a lot of times when people have unexpected or quirky, potentially strange interests, they don't know how to talk about it, or they're afraid that if they give into it, if they lean into it, people aren't going to take them as seriously. Maybe they won't think I'm going to make leaps and bounds breakthroughs in robotics research because they'll know that I have this passion for stand-up comedy, or for, rock climbing, or for, Argentinian tango, to use something I'm personally passionate about. Mm-hmm. But, in fact, when you're multi-layered, especially when you're multi-layered in a way where you've introspected about how those different interests feed into each other and strengthen each other, it makes you kind of unforgettable. It makes you really pop off the page, and it makes the reader or the interviewer form new connections in their head, and that's dynamizing. It's interesting. So be a bit of a misfit if you are, lean into that. It's beautiful.
Okay. That sounds good. So we have a question from Michael, who is a CLS 2021 alum and a fellow first-gen student. He's chiming in from his semester in Morocco. He asks, how can I turn my passion for Arabic language and culture into a job?
Hello, Michael. Great to be in touch. Stay in touch, please. How to do that? Go granular. Granularity is your asset. It is your strength when you're interested in a specific language or in a specific region or area studies. What you have that a lot of other people lack, people in fields ranging from journalism to academia to think tank work to diplomacy, what you're going to have, what you're building right now on the ground, is facility in a local language, in a local context. Immerse yourself as much as possible. Learn as much Arabic as you possibly can. Learn as many varieties of Arabic as you possibly can. Understand that if you have any interest in writing or publishing, you can start doing that. You can start being a freelance journalist. You can start writing up analysis or making films, vlogging, whatever else, publishing as soon as you want to. There is no law that says that you even have to have an undergraduate degree. So immerse yourself, go granular, get as much language as you can, get as much local, political, or whatever cultural other knowledge as you can, and start using it if you want to build up your profile.
Yes, and even though you're in academia, you've also written, like, as a journalist for think tanks and places like the New York Times. Why did you decide to do that?
I think in large part because if you only write academic scholarly literature, you're basically confining yourself to paywalled, they're often paywalled, peer-reviewed journal articles that even most of your colleagues won't read, if they're being totally honest. Even if they cite them, that doesn't always mean that they read them. For the broader population of thinking people who are curious about, whatever you're writing about, be it educational policy in Libya or gender relations in Turkey or whatever else, they're not going to know those journals or want to pay $30 to read an article, or have the time for that. So try to speak to everybody. One topic can have 3 or 4 different lives. It can have a life in a piece of journalism, in an op-ed written for a newspaper. It can have a life in a think tank report, analysis for policymakers. It can have a life in a scholarly book or a journal article. And you can talk about it on media. If all smart, highly informed people who have that granularity that we were talking about decide not to give interviews to CNN or Fox News or wherever else, we wall ourselves off. And I grew up in a community where basically the only access I had to news was cable news stations like that. We didn't get the New York Times. Not that we could have afforded a subscription, even if they did deliver. So I think it's important to try to be as accessible as possible, because you never know what 12-year-old child like me when I was little is sponging up and wanting to learn and wanting to get more layers.
Have you been back to Kentucky?
Yes, I have been.
And I would imagine that it's got to be just such a different world, like based on where you've been, because you've been like Tunisia, Turkey, Jordan, United Arab Emirates, and then to go back to Kentucky. What's that like?
Yeah, I think going back is always harder. Most of my adult life now, since that first scholarship to Tanzania, when I was 20, most of my adult life now has been living in Africa, Europe, the Middle East. And it's a lot more comfortable for me, to be honest, than it is to be in the States. I feel so far away from everything sometimes when I'm in the States, even when I'm in a city like New York sometimes, because people don't always know how to engage with you when you say, well, I was just, in Istanbul or just was living there. They don't always know what to ask or how to tap in. And that can, weirdly enough, it can feel more isolating than if you're in a place like Dubai or Tunis or Cairo or Beirut, where, a lot of international journalists who cover the region cycle in and out. You get think tankers, you get policymakers, you have your tribe to talk to, So I think it's a harder adjustment, to be honest.
Yeah. And what do you find is the most important when it comes to fitting into a new culture?
A sense of humor. Being able to laugh at yourself a lot, because you're probably not going to fit in, or you're not going to ever perfectly fit in. You'll always have a strange accent. Learning a second or third or fourth language is really, really difficult, and you'll probably sound like a weirdo. You'll say a lot of things wrong. You'll make people laugh. You'll put, your clothes the wrong way, or put your shoes in the wrong place, and you'll talk out of turn and maybe offend people sometimes. And being able to laugh at yourself and being comfortable being the strange person in a group can be very useful qualities. And I think I'll just add on to this. Always enjoying being a beginner in something also helps, because when you're immersing yourself in a new culture, a new language, especially, you're a baby in many ways. You might have like a professor's brain, but you'll be trapped in the linguistic abilities of an 8-year-old. And that's after you study the language for a couple of years, often. So you have to almost groove off of being a beginner. And I would say that quality of loving being a beginner in something and always trying to be a beginner in something, and loving getting over your head, loving a good, hard challenge, something that you'll never master, but you try it anyway. Those are great qualities for immersing yourself in a new culture, but also for applications to scholarships and beyond. It's a very attractive quality in an applicant because it shows a truly intellectual, truly hungry mind.
Yes. We actually, speaking of beginners, we have a question from an undergraduate from Sajad, who asks, would a gap of 1 year during undergraduate degree have any effect on the selection process for scholarships to master's programs, especially someone who left their home university for 1 or 2 semesters for an exchange program, such as Global UGrad?
I don't know what Global UGrad is, but if you're making an interesting use of your year, if you're traveling abroad somewhere new and exciting, or you're learning a new language, or you're doing an interesting internship or something, or you're just taking a year to like write and report, or like do art and presenting galleries or whatever, that's great. It'll actually help you. In fact, I did that. My year in Tanzania on the Boren Scholarship studying Swahili and refugee rights law, it was a year out of my undergraduate trajectory. I had a full ride scholarship to my undergraduate university. So I asked them, can you please press the pause button on this? I don't want to turn down free money to smorgasbord gorge myself on your classes, but I want to do this State Department scholarship to Tanzania. They said, yeah. So I did 5 years in undergrad. Helped me get 3 majors, 2 minors, and it made me a much more interesting human being. I'm a huge fan of gap years, whether they come in the middle of your university trajectory, before, after, whatever. There's no rush. It's much better to be an interesting, independent, kind of weird thinker, as long as you can align and connect everything somehow, than it is to be an out-of-the-box cookie cutter type. Too many students who want to go to law school, for example, just major in political science, because they think that's what you have to do to go to law school. Or I want to be a doctor, so I'm going to do biology. I'm going to do my 4 years and I'm going to apply. And everybody kind of looks alike to these committees, to these admissions committees. To get somebody who's really kind of weird and 3-dimensional and offers a lot more depth, brings to the table unique experiences, that's the ticket.
Okay. So, yeah, but I'm just thinking about all the travel that you've done. And we have a question here from Jada, who's asking, what advice would you have for students who had their education interrupted by COVID-19, especially ones whose international education experiences have been limited?
Yeah, I would say, just like with the gap year comments that I just made, make an interesting and productive use of your time. COVID-19 almost forced a gap year on a lot of people. And you can react in one of 2 ways, broadly speaking. You can kind of, hang your head and just kind of stay in one place and stagnate. Or you can say, okay, well, since I can't really go out much, or since I couldn't, travel to China because of all their COVID restrictions, I'm going to get on like italki, this language learning website, or Conversation Exchange, another language learning website, and I'm going to find a Chinese conversational partner. And maybe I'm also going to find like a local Chinese calligraphy class, if you're lucky enough to live in a big city where there's a Confucius Institute or something like that. Or, I'm going to immerse myself as a global citizen or as a student of Chinese anyway, because I'm hungry and I'm self-motivated. Or maybe I'm going to, if you want to be a writer, a published writer someday, maybe find a way to do some long distance reporting. or analysis, or do book reviews of interesting new Chinese novels in translation or something and try to publish those. In other words, immerse yourself and do interesting, productive things, even if you have to sit on your butt on the couch all day at home. It's possible.
Okay, that is great advice. So it looks like we're just about out of time. But before we go, what would be your number one tip for those who are applying for scholarships like the Fulbright or CLS?
Oh, number one tip. Align what you're good at, what you're passionate about, and what makes you angry. Find the place where those three circles overlap in a Venn diagram. That's your golden triangle. And think about how to make that into a career. Then, in your personal statement, build a narrative that introduces the reader to you authentically, to the main thing inside the pit of your stomach that made you want to get interested in pursuing that golden triangle. Maybe you'll need to dig deep. Maybe you'll need to go to places in your childhood that you might not like to spend much time in. Anger usually comes from a place. Passion usually comes from a place. It can come from a deep place. Don't be worried to make yourself a little bit vulnerable, to introduce people to the real you. But don't get stuck there. Make a vision, paint a picture of the future you and how you're going to fight your sliver of the world's fight. Make your past, your present activities, and your future goals lined up. Stack them. Stack them in your CV and stack them in your personal statement. I know that it's easier said than done, and a lot of you in the audience might be thinking, what the hell does that mean? They're kind of general pieces of advice. You learn more as you go. Try to do that. There were parts of my background, like having quite a religiously conservative upbringing that some might have called cultish, or having parents who didn't finish high school that I honestly didn't know how to talk about, and I didn't feel really comfortable talking about for the longest time. It wasn't until my Rhodes interview where I really made myself reach deep into my stomach and yank it out and learn how to talk about it. But it was important. It made me understand myself better, my own goals better, and it helped the committee get to know me better. And then if you fail, you go out being true to yourself. Don't hide what makes you strange and interesting. Make interesting connections to make it all cohere into that golden triangle.
Okay. I like that. I like the Venn diagram and the golden triangle. It's easy to visualize. Thanks, Monica. So thank you so much for being with us today. You're welcome.
My pleasure. My pleasure. Great to be here.
Good. And we also want to say a big thank you to our online viewers for participating. If you're interested in learning more about our awesome Exchange alumni, you can visit our website at alumni.state.gov. And you can also follow us on LinkedIn, Instagram, and Twitter. Thanks for watching, and see you all in December for our next Mentor Talks.